Welcome back team, how's it going? Today we'll be going through my complete guide to blind picking in top lane. Out of all 5 roles in League, top lane is the hardest to blind pick in by far, but unfortunately some games we will be blue side or our support player might be completely trolling and not want to swap with us, so in that case, you really need to learn how to maximize your impact in their game, even though you may be blind picking and stuck in a counter matchup. So in this video we'll be breaking down how exactly you can do so, what to watch out for, to make sure you're blind picking a champion that's going to increase your chance of winning the game and not decrease it. So if that sounds good to you, then let's get started. Now we're going to start off by breaking down what exactly makes a champion a good blind pick, so that you have a better understanding of why there's certain champions that you should be selecting for your main blind, and why other champions like Shyvana should never see the light of day. And I'm just going to keep a blind pick tier list in the background. I'm not going to go through every champ one by one or anything, it's just going to highlight my point, because there are 3 main points that you need to keep in mind that really make a champion a good blind, and all the champions at the top will have these. So in order, starting with number 1, a large matchup spread. So what I mean by that is a champion does well into every type of class, or as many as possible. So Jace, for example, he does well into range tops, bruiser tops, carries like Camille Fiora, and also good into tanks now with the grass page. So there's no real hard counter to him in terms of class, where if you pick a champion later on, like Garen, you're going to really struggle into good range top players like Kennen, Aurora, all that stuff. Jace is not really going to run into that issue. He's going to be fine into pretty much every class of champion in the game. Now, another example would be a champ like Warwick, who even into a ranged matchup is not going to be amazing or anything, but you're going to be fine. You can get Prior, you can go even CS, you can now sustain the damage, so there's no real class of champion, or even specific counters that's going to make your life very difficult if you're a champion in S tier, or high on this list as an example. Now for number 2, useful versus most team comps. So whatever the enemy team picks, your champion has to be useful into these most of the time. Now you're not going to be useful into every single champ in the game, of course, but Jace as our example, actually let's use Mbessa, let's mix it up. It doesn't really matter what you're up against, your champion's always going to have value. You're a champion that spikes really hard in the mid game, doesn't scale that badly, strong early game, hard engage, you provide a lot of threat in a team fight. There's nothing really you're going to verse that makes it really difficult. Yes, there are going to be harder comps than most. If you verse full disengage like Braum support and Zyra stuff like that, you're not going to have as much fun, but you're still going to do way better into that than a champion like Jax, because you're just better as a blind overall, not just for your matchup spread, but also into the majority of team comps. And our final point, useful with most team comps. And this one is the bottom of the list for a reason. The first 2, especially the first one, has to be your top priority. So useful with most team comps, what that means is no matter what your teammates pick, even if they pick some garbage champions like Kayn, stuff like that, your champion's still going to be useful in the game. Where if you have a Kayn jungle and you pick a champion like Fiora, it's going to feel completely awful. Or if you have a scaling jungler and you pick a champion like Kayle, again, that's going to feel miserable. You're probably going to get run over in the early game. So useful with most team comps can matter to a degree, but it has to be your bottom of the list, where let's use an example like Cassiopeia. You're always going to be insane in a front-to-back style, but you're not going to be useful against every single team comp, of course. If you have heavy outrange, like a Xerath mid and a long-range AD carry, Jinx Lulu, stuff like that, you're not going to do as well as if you versed a melee champ that has to run into you. So that's why this is the bottom of the list. It doesn't really matter as much. It's just something to keep in mind. You don't really want to be blinding a champion that's useless in a lot of comps. So a great example would be Karma. She's not on my list because she's not really played that much, but she's probably not would be S rank in terms of large matchup spread. There's no real hard counter to him. Maybe an Insane Irelia or something like that. But unfortunately, she's quite useless into most team comps and quite useless with them as well. You need a very specific comp relying around your jungler playing around you and you supporting them to make this champion work, which is not reliable in solo queue, which is why it's on the list, because champions that might be a good blind, like Gragas or like Karma, they're not going to be useful with every single team comp. Now, Gragas is very useful versus a lot of them. He does well into range, into melee, stuff like that, which is why even though he's not the most useful with every team comp in the game, he's still going to be really high on this list. So just keep in mind the large matchup spread has to be your number 1, and then usefulness, regardless of what champions are played, is going to be more of a secondary importance. Moving on to high impact blind picks. And in my opinion, this is the most important part of this whole guide, especially if you have a few champions in your champ pool and you don't like to abuse the meta. So of course, if you want to be the best at blind picking every meta, you want to abuse the champions that are strongest. So at the moment, Jason, Bessa, Cassante, those champs are really strong and they're not going to go away anytime soon. So those will be your best blind pick. But what if you don't want to meta abuse or you just don't really like those champions? There are ways that you can still be extremely impactful as a blind, even though the matchup spread on the champions that you like to play might be quite difficult. So we'll start off by going through a bunch of examples, but the main thing you're looking to do to be a high impact blind is counter the enemy team. So you should always try to pick as late in the draft as possible. 4-5 on blue, you see 4 of the enemy team's champions, so you can still pick a champion that's really, really useful in that game, even though you might verse some loser champion like Varus Top or whatever, and be in an unplayable matchup, you can still be useful later on. So to give some examples, starting with Darius. Even though his matchup spread is not the best out of any champ out there, of course, if you verse a range top like Kennen or a good Jace player, it's not going to be that fun. If you pick Darius in the right situation, you're always going to be extremely impactful, even if you lose lane. So Darius is best when you see a lot of beefcake champions that have to run towards you, especially melee mids. So if they pick, let's say, Jarvan jungle, Vi, champs that have to come towards you, Skarner, and mid is a champ like Sylas, you're going to be extremely useful in that game, regardless of what your matchup is. You might verse the best Aurora player of all time, it doesn't matter, because you're going to be so useful in that game, because Sylas, Jarvan, or any other melee jungle that goes forward has to run towards you, which means it's really easy for you to play that nice front to back style that Darius likes and get a reset. And it doesn't matter if you're down a level, down 30 farm, you're still going to be highly impactful in that game. Where if you blind Darius and you verse a bunch of range champs like Zyra jungle, Hui mid, champs like that, and then you get countered by Jace, you're going to have a really, really unlucky time, unhappy time in that game. So it's important that you try to blind pick champions that do well into the rest of their comp. Another example would be Olaf. Now, Olaf is best into any team comp that has high CC and low damage. So if they have a tank jungle like a Zac, Sejuani, Vi, doesn't really have high sustained damage, mid is a low DPS champion, maybe like a Sylas again, or a champion like Lux, you're probably going to be really impactful. Nautilus support champs like that, you're going to be very useful even if you verse a amazing Vayne player or Aurora, a really hard matchup, you're still going to have a lot of value in that game. Now, our next example is Jax. So Jax does have quite a rough matchup spread. You lose into a lot of tanks, like Gragas Malphite's not that fun, and a lot of range tops like Ken and Aurora. Jace, also very sad. But if you pick Jax when they have auto-attacking base champions in jungle and mid, you're going to be really impactful regardless. So if you see Graves jungle, Viego, Jarvan, any jungle that's really centered around auto-attacking, that's where a lot of their DPS and usefulness comes in, you're going to be useful. Same with mid. If they have an Akshar mid, Tristana not as good, she has so much disengage, but that style of champion, even if you play a tough matchup versus a good Gragas player, you're still going to be very, very impactful in that game. So another example would be Gwen, similar to Darius. If you verse Meatballs, a tank comp that's running forward, even if you verse a good Pantheon or Riven, something like that, you're going to be fine. So if they have jungle Sejuani, jungle Zac, Skarner, just these meatballies that go forward, even like a Jarvan or a Vi typically fine, compared to versing like a Brand or a Neferi, you're going to have a tough time if you verse those types of champions. And a counter match up top, your value in the game will be quite low, unless the enemy top misplays or anything like that. Now next we have Irelia. So Irelia, if you verse a good Renekton player, not going to be that fun, but if you pick Irelia when you see their comp, and they have low CC, you're going to have a great time. Aurelia's biggest weakness is being locked down in a fight, but let's say you verse Graves jungle, a mid with no CC, I don't know, like a Zed or something, maybe a Lux, just a Q you have to play around, just a low CC comp in general, supporters like Yuumi or Bard, something like that, not really any hard lockdown, you're probably going to be really useful in that game, even if your matchup sucks. And for our next example, we have Dr. Mundo. And this is the champion that I like to call a game-breaking counter pick, but it can work as a blind as well if you pick it in the right situation. So if you ever verse a low DPS team comp, even if you verse a tricky lane by blind picking them, you're going to be completely Thanos in that game. So what I mean by low DPS are champions that don't have sustained damage to chew through the region of your ulti. So from AD carry, champs like Jhin, champs like Israel, they don't have high DPS or percent HP, anything like that. It's really easy for you to out-tank them and just tank their entire team, especially if the rest of their comp doesn't have sustained DPS. But if it's the reverse, maybe you pick it just because you see a Jhin, but they have a Zed mid, or they have Master Yi jungle, something like that, you're still going to get run down, you're still going to get bursted through. So you have to be really careful when blinding this champion, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're weak early game, and they counter matchup, and not that good into the rest of their comp as well. You have to see all 4 champions, which is why you pick 4-5 on blue, and see that their DPS is so low, and even if they pick a DPS top, it's going to be really hard for the top laner to solo kill you. Very few champions can chew through Mundo ulti. Gwen would probably be the best, but if you verse the rest of their comp that's low DPS and you're quite mobile as well, it's still going to be worth it in that situation. And just to top it off with one more example, just a simple one, Poppy into a lot of dashes. If you verse Lee Sin Rakan, you're probably going to be really useful in that game, even if you verse a good Darius or something like that. Keep in mind it's better to pick Poppy into engaged dashes, like a Jarvan or Lee Sin, compared to disengaged dashes like Tristana, stuff like that. Still useful, don't get me wrong, but better to be more of that peel style tank. So the examples I just mentioned are the most impactful blind picks you can have in the right situation, not including the champions in S tier who are just going to be really impactful no matter what, as their matchup spread is so OP. And if I didn't mention your champion, don't panic. That doesn't mean there aren't situations where your champion would be good. I just mentioned the more noticeable ones. Now, moving on to another situation that you can find yourself in to be a higher impactful blind picker, and that is team synergy. So picking champions that do well with the champions on your team. But one thing I want to make extremely clear, don't do this very often. You mainly want to be picking based on what the enemy team picks, I'd say 9 times out of 10, 19 out of 20, and not really worrying about your teammates' champions that much. So an example is playing Camille when you have a Galio. Even if you play Camille in a sad matchup, if you have the Camille-Galio combo, you're going to be extremely impactful in that game, because Camille is one of the best engagers in the game in terms of abilities, but she's not an engaged champion. You're just going to die most of the time if you try to start the fight, but with Galio that completely changes your options. Galio is also really useful early game, where Camille needs a bit of time to get Triforce, so those two champions work really well together. Now, picking around your jungle, if they have a strong AP jungler, like a Nidalee, Talia, or a Brand, skill shot based AP junglers, even champs like Zyra, Renekton is going to be really, really good. Now, don't rely on your jungler just because you pick Renekton. That's going to make you tilted. I know from past experience, every time I pick Renekton with Nidalee, it's a 50% chance if I regret it or not, but it is going to be a high impact blind for you if you're a Renekton player. Let's say your champ pool, just to give a random one, you like to play Renekton, Garen, maybe a little bit of Jack, something like that, and you're blinding. If you have like a Talia or a Brand jungle, Renekton's going to be the best blind for you in that situation, because you make their champ significantly more useful as well, and you already play Renekton. But if you're not a Renekton guy, don't pick it with those champions. Same with Camille. Don't pick Camille just because you have a Galio on your team. You need to have good champ mastery on that champion. Now, another one would be if you have a carry jungler like a Graves or a Kindred, frontline and CC is going to be really impactful. Of course, we're top laners. We like it more when our jungler provides the frontline and CC, but that's not going to be realistic every game. So if you have a strong front-to-back team comp with low CC, maybe an enchanter support like Soraka, and your jungler is what we just mentioned, Graves or Kindred, just playing a tank is going to be really impactful in that game, like an Ornn or a Gragas. Of course, if you're an Aurelia or a Fiora player, probably just play your main champion, but if you feel like you have a pretty decent champ pool and your team comp is just full of high damage dealers, high DPS, low CC frontline, playing a tank is probably going to be your highest chance of winning in that game. Again, don't rely on your Graves to play well just because you picked around him, but if your whole team comp, not just your jungler, would really benefit from having a strong frontline high CC champion, you're going to do great. But keep in mind, that doesn't just mean a tank. You can play a bruiser with frontline CC as well, like a Renekton or a Jax. He's not going to be as good, of course, in that game, but if that's in your champion pool, just keep in mind, you don't want to have a Graves and then pick a low CC and like a full damage champion. Same with Master Yi jungle. Most of the time you want to be either playing around your team comp in that situation, or playing a good middle ground champion like a strong bruiser with CC. Moving on to bad blind picks. I'm not just talking about the champions at the bottom of my tier list that we saw earlier. Champions like Trundle, champions like Malphite, we know why they're bad blind picks. There are too many matchups that make the champion unplayable. I'm talking about bad blind picks for a champion that may seem like a good blind on paper, because their matchup spread is good, but may be a bad blind pick in the certain situation. So one thing to keep in mind is your champion is always going to have common counter picks that you're going to run into consistently. So if those same common counter picks also do well into the champions on your team, you may need to hold out on playing your champion. So the best example of this is if you have an auto-attacking based jungler, a champion like Graves or Kindred or Viego, and you play a champion that Jax is really good into, like Camille or Yone or Kayle. You're making Jax Thanos in that game when you don't need to, because even if you play extremely well and you win that counter matchup, the Jax will still be very useful in that game, and your jungler's value goes down significantly, where if you blinded a champion that shits on Jax, then you're not going to have that same issue if they even pick it for some reason, you're in a good matchup, which they're not going to. So it's really important that you don't pick a champion that the common counters to you are also good into your comp, which is why I did this section after the Thanos counters we talked about, the high impact counter picks. Really important that you keep in mind at least the champions I mentioned in that section. Another example would be a champion like Kayle. If you also have a scaling jungler, if you have a champion like Kayn, hopefully you never have to play with that champ, but you're probably going to be not that useful in that game. The early game is going to be way too difficult. You're both scaling top and jungle, so you're going to get completely ran over. They're going to get a 6-4 Void Grubs, your early game's going to be a disaster, and your team is probably going to FF before you even get level 16, so that's going to be a risky blind for you. Or if you blinded Kale, and you have the Rek'Sai or something like that, you're going to have a better time. Now, another one is playing magic damage champions with champs that love to be solo AP. So champs like Karthus is notable, Zyra or Bran, just a strong heavy AP jungler. You don't really want to be playing like a Vladimir or a Gragas, even though those are great blind pick champions. You don't want to pick them in that situation, as you're making MR too valuable and lowering the value of your jungler and your champion as well in that situation. Now, something to keep in mind with this point is it's not going to matter as much for the average player. Your top priority should always be your matchup or picking champions that's good into the enemy team comp. This is just something extra that you can keep in mind on the side, especially if you only play 1 or 2 champions, or if you're playing in Diamond Plus, mainly Masters Plus, where a lot of the players are better at counter picking you. You need to be very careful to ruin your team comp in this way. But for the average player, let's say Emerald and below, especially below Emerald, just play the champions that you're best at. But if you do have a pool, pick the champion that looks the best into the enemy team's champs based on the 4 champions that you see on champ select. Now, even though in the high impact blind pick section I did cover a bunch of different champions that are the more game breaking blind picks, I'm still going to go through the top 25 more popular champions just to give a better understanding of when these champions are best to be blinded. Even if you play a bad matchup, your impact will be a little bit higher if you know what to look out for. Now, starting with Set, he really hates playing into high range and disengage. So if you're blinding Set and they have champs like Zyra jungle, Hui mid, champs like Braum, a bunch of bullshit they're going to throw at you and disengage, you're not going to have a good time. But if you verse a bunch of melees that come towards you, especially melee jungle mid, you're going to have a much more impactful time in that game. Now, with Darius, we already covered him, so we'll go to Mordekaiser. He actually is in a unique spot. He does well into a lot of champions, or comps, that top laners typically hate, and specifically Enchanter comps. So if you verse like a Jinx or Lulu, you can 1v1 the Jinx or the Lulu, and all of their power really comes from working together. You can make it really difficult for them to function. Even a comp like Zyra Khan, where Rakan being their primary engage, you can just catch the Rakan out, make it really hard for him to be impactful. Not as good, of course, there are probably going to be certain games where there are higher impact targets in the support, but bot lane combos that work really well together, Kalista Taric, champs like that have really game-breaking abilities, like Lulu combo and Taric ulti. Mord does really well into them, where a lot of other bruisers really hate it. Now, with Aatrox, he's more of a jack of all trades. He's fine into range, fine into melee. He's pretty much Ambessa, but the old version, not the Season 14 version, where Ambessa is just completely broken and always overpowered. Aatrox is just always pretty good. Now, with Garen, he's similar in a way where you just play your own game on Garen. It doesn't matter too much what their comp is. Of course, you'd rather verse melees that you can duel, like a Diana jungle and stuff like that, than a bunch of disengage, like Zyra or Bran, champs like that. He's going to do better into that, and you prefer more so engage supports than disengage. Braum is quite annoying for you. You'd rather verse a Nautilus, something like that, but typically he doesn't mind as much. Now, with Yorick, of course, you're mainly going to be spending your game inside lane. So if they pick any jungler, that's quite easy for you to 1v2, even if you're in a tricky matchup, or create a lot of pressure without dying. Maybe if they have like a Graves or a Lee Sin, not really that scary, or a Viego, compared to if they have a really annoying champion for you, like an Evelynn or something like that, that can make it quite brutal for you, or Neferi, champs that can just one-shot you inside. Now, for Yone, he's typically a champion that you also like stuff on your team. So Yone is really, really good follow-up engage. So if you have, let's say, a Zac jungle, Leona support, Yone is going to be amazing even if your matchup sucks. But if you verse a bunch of disengage and your team is just playing some shitty champs like Graves, Soraka, probably going to be an awful Yone game for you. Now, Teemo, he's pretty similar to Garen, you just play your own game, but he prefers to verse melees, so you really don't want to verse control mages, high-range champions, Xerath, Hui, champs like that. Really, really brutal, like a Syndra, where if you get hit by one skill shot, you're just instantly dead. Of course, not the best time for you, where if you verse champs that have to go in, it's a lot easier for you. He also doesn't really like assassins like Akali that much, but you'd probably rather verse Akali than a strong control mage. Now, with Malphite, only blind him if you're banning Sylas, keep that in mind. But if someone else is playing it, maybe it's banned, he's of course going to be really good into heavy AD, especially heavy AD and mobile comps. So even if you play, let's say Sylas is banned, and you verse a Rumble or a Gragas, really tough matchup. But they have Graves jungle, a Philios AD carry, your champ's going to be completely overpowered. Now, with Renekton, we talked a little bit about him. You're picking him in champ with strong AP junglers. You can set up a lot of ganks. That's going to be good for you. He's also a champion that's really strong early game. So if you're playing with champions that are also good early, you can really speed up the pace of the game and force a lot of early fights. But if you pick Renekton and you have like Kayn jungle, like Zerayumi bottom, it's going to be quite annoying for you because you're going to be Thanos. 1 to 2 items you're really going to want to get stuck in, but your teammates aren't, so you have to play it a bit more slow, which is not really your identity. So it's good to play Renekton with strong early game team comps. Now with Jax. So we talked about him, heavy auto attackers, we don't need to touch more on that. Sion's a champion where you're just a tank, so having high DPS on your team is going to be extremely useful for you. So if you play a Sion and you have like a Z mid, Gen 80 carry, or something like that, probably not going to be the best time for you. But if you're Sion with like an Azir mid or a Jinx, a Phelios 80 carry, and you have this big beefy frontline for them, all you need to do is keep them alive and they'll do the rest. Really useful game for you to be a tank like Sion. Now, with Nessus, it really depends on the jungler, I would say. Of course, he doesn't really like to verse high range either, but if there's a jungler that's quite easy for you to deal with, especially if you can just neutralize them with Wither, like a Kindred or a Graves, their champ's just out of the game if you press W on them. Of course, that's going to be great for you. Even a champion like Jarvan doesn't really matter that much for you. But if you verse a high threat, like an Elise, that can be quite tricky for you to get through the early game. Now, with Jace, of course, he's just completely broken Blind Pig. There is no situation that he sucks in. I would say he prefers not to verse hard engage. So if they have like Vi or like Neferi with some engage champion mid, they can follow them up. Nautilus, Leona, champs like that, and then you get counter picked up. Another engage champ. It's probably going to be really hard for you to play the game. So he prefers not to verse a full engage comp. Now, with Kayle, this is mainly dependent on what the enemy jungler is playing. So I've actually played quite a bit of Kayle recently, and the thing that's the most annoying is not really being in an unplayable top matchup, it's in an unplayable jungle matchup. So if you have the Kayn or the Graves, and they get the Rek'Sai, or they get the Elise, especially a champion like Elise that's really good at diving, you are going to be completely miserable in that game, no matter what your matchup is, because they're going to counterpick you. They're not going to give you a free lane on Kayle. Even if you're playing in bronze and you blind pick Kayle, I doubt they're going to give you a free beam, so you're going to verse that, plus the strong jungler, you're going to have a really difficult time. But if you're blinding Kayle, if you want to, and you see their jungler is just like Kayn, or some shit-stained weakling like Graves, then you're going to be able to scale a lot more freely. Now, with Gwen, so we talked about her before, any melee champion that comes towards you with beef, the more the better. You're going to be very, very useful in that game, but if you verse a lot of high range, high disengage, it's going to be the complete opposite. Now, with Volibear, you like to get a lot of work done early, similar to Renekton, so champions that go in are going to be really good for you. Champions that like to play fast and exploit the game early game, that's going to be the way for you to go. Now, with Fiora, I'd say it doesn't really matter too much. You're going to be side laning most of the time, but versing a jungler, pretty similar to Yorick, that you can deal with quite easily, is going to feel good. So a champion like Viego or a champion like Jarvan or Vi, quite easy for you to counter with your parry and play around them very, very easily. Where if you verse maybe Neferi or Rylai's Brand or something really annoying, Lilia, especially Lilia, you're going to have a very, very sad time in that game. Now, Aurelia, we talked about her. Really low CC comps. Mundo, low DPS comps, we talked about him. So for Riven is kind of similar to Irelia. If they have a low CC comp, you're going to be golden. Let's just give you the dream team. Let's say they have Jhin, Soraka, mid is like a Z, and jungle is just any champ without CC, doesn't really matter. You're going to be fine. You're going to be completely 1v9 in that game. Even if you do have to verse like a Renekton, probably ban Renekton if you're playing Riven. Even if you have to verse like a good Ambessa or a Ken, something like that. If the rest of their comp is low CC, your game is going to be a lot easier for you. Now for Urgot, he really hates versing high range. So a lot of, control mages like Hui, Zyra, Brand, you've probably heard me say that a lot, but it's just true. The champions I mention frequently are just champions a lot of top laners hate to verse. Me personally, every time I see Lilia or Brand or Zyra meta, I'm very, very sad. I'm locked away because those champions just counter the majority of top lane champs, and Urgot is no exception. So any high range kind of zone control champion sucks for you, but champs that can go near you or have to go in feel amazing. Now with Shen, this is a champion where your goal is to create 5v4s inside and then join your team. So if you're versing a low threat jungler, especially auto attack based ones like Viego, Graves or something like that, where they're not going to be able to kill you very easily, that's going to be really good for you. But if you verse a champ that can easily pick you in side lane, like an Evelynn or maybe a Nocturne's not too bad for Shen, but a Nocturne ulti can be annoying for you as well because you can't ulti your teammates of Nocturne ulti, so you need to keep that in mind as well. So I'll keep them on the list like Evelynn or a Nocturne. That can be not as good for you, but typically Shen, if you're playing Shen, you're probably a Shen main, so you don't have to worry about it too much. Now with Gangplank, so GP is really, really OP if they have a mobile mid 80 carry. So you've probably seen it picked in LCK, and a lot of the time, if you actually go through the VODs, it's because they've just that. If they have a Jinx, Victor, or Hui, a Phelios, something like that, really a mobile 80 carries, Gangplank is just the king, because your ulti completely removes their agency in the fight. Your ulti does so much damage late game, and of course your barrels are very easy to hit on a mobile target, so they have to click away, so they can't really play the fight into you. Where if you play GP, and they have Kai'Sa 80 carry, and some mid that flies on in, let's just say Irelia or let's just say Yone, your champ's value is going to be very, very low. They're just going to hard engage onto you, onto your team. They're not going to have to stay in your ulti too long. Another example that's good, a champion like Xayah, where a lot of top lanes hate running into Xayah. GP doesn't have to dump your ulti on her head, get the barrels lined up, and she really can't play. So a mobile carries is what you're looking for Gangplank. And to finish off, we'll go through Gnar. Now, Gnar is very, very stable. He's a really good blind pick, I'd say, in terms of his matchup spread. However, the champs that he loves to verse are melees that go towards you. So if you verse, let's say they've got a Vi jungle, something like that, Jarvan, champs like that, Lee Sin, anything that's just melee and has to play near you and you can kite them out, that's going to feel great for you. And if they have high range, high CC, it's going to be really annoying, high zone control, stuff like that. It can be quite brutal, especially if they have really good engage, like a Rel, they can just snap onto you. It can be quite annoying for you. However, Gnar is kind of similar to Aatrox in the way. He doesn't really care that much about what he versus. He's more of a all-rounding champion, so I wouldn't tunnel too hard on it for him. He's a really stable blind pick. Now, I'm going to wrap up this guide by going through my final advice for blind picking, especially for the players out there that don't really want to change their champion pool that much. You might have 1, 2, or 3 champions that you love playing, but you feel like every time you're blind picking and you're in a hard matchup, you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So my number 1 tip for that, for every player out there, first of all, select your main champion. Every player needs a champion, where no matter what's happening, no matter what meta, back against the wall, Game 5 World Finals, you need a sub in for Zeus, you have that one champion that you'd feel the most comfortable playing. Now, once you've selected it, go through all the matchups from that champ and write down the ones that you don't really like, the matchups that you struggle with. Try to order them based on how popular the champions are. So if you hate versing Alawi and Set, Alawi has probably less than a 1% pick rate, Set has like a 9, of course Set is going to be a higher priority for you. Now, once you have that, that's when you need to find some players that like to play your champion. So I recommend you can just go on Dplol, find your champion, and find a bunch of players from your server, or NA and EU together. It's really easy to make a level 1 account for those servers, and find, let's say, 5 or 6 players that play your champion. Now you can just save them, go through their match history just once a day in a folder, and if they ever play the matchups that you wrote down, any of them, you can watch that VOD. You now have access to the VOD, log in, watch it through the client, and write down what they're doing well, what they do differently, and try to really build mastery on these matchups one by one. I don't really recommend, of course you can, like YouTube, just searching Camille vs Jax, you're probably going to find a video where the Camille gets 2 kills or a gank at level 2, something like that. It's better to find more of a raw solo queue VOD. That's not just a clickbait, pick and chosen game. So if you can have 5 or 6 players written down, saved in a little folder, you can just open that up once every day or two. And if they ever play a matchup that you want to see, you can watch it and really see what they're doing differently to you. Because really likely, if you pick the right players that have high mastery on your champion, you're going to learn a lot from them.